the Honourable Minister for Education, Culture and Arts, the Honourable Assistant Ministers Vijay Nath, Vina Bhatnagar, and Salayan Maitonga, and all the other dignitaries, members of the Diplomatic Corps. It's actually very hard to see how many people are out there. The chairs are so big. I think everybody sort of sunk into the chairs. But it gives me a great pleasure to be here. And frankly, the commemoration of the arrival of the Girmitiers in Fiji, in fact, started in a very big manner, if you like, back in 2016, when government then commemorated the arrival of the last ship that brought the last batch of Girmitiers to Fiji. That was in 1916. The ship's name was Sutherland 5. The first ship obviously was Leonidas, that came in 1879 and brought the first batch of indentured laborers. I don't know how many of you know, but the reason why they are called Girmitiers is because, as you know, there was slavery that existed in the 17th and 18th century globally. Imperial Europe obviously transported slaves all across the different continents, into USA, into South America, into the Caribbean, predominantly from Africa. And there was a movement in Europe to abolish slavery. It was somewhat accepted, but nonetheless, because of the imperatives of the colonial economic system, cheap labor, or in fact free labor, was what was demanded. And so the British actually came up with called the Indentured labor system, where they tried to pass off essentially slavery to say we have an agreement with those people who want to come and work for us. So they called it the agreement between the employer and the employee. Those laborers that were brought from British India, I'll tell you a story about how they were brought from British India. And I say British India because at that time Britain occupied what we today know as India, Bangladesh and Pakistan. It was all one British India. And the people who came, they actually could not say agreement. They called it Girmit. Instead of saying agreement, they called it Girmit. In the same way as many people would know, many words get buried. You know, cane top is called kantat. So agreement became Girmit. So those people who signed the agreement, signed the Girmit, became known as the Girmitiers. And the name actually has stuck since then. So the Girmitiers, over 60,000, about 60,500 Girmitiers were transported, or what I say exported, from British India, which Fiji imported, to essentially work as laborers. But bulk of them actually worked in the sugarcane industry. Because wherever a colonizing power went into any country, they needed to have the economic activity to be able to fund the colonial system. In Fiji, the then colonial government decided that sugar, because cotton had failed prior to Fiji became a colony, cotton was one of the main industries in Fiji. That had failed because of a particular disease that spread throughout the cotton industry. So they chose sugarcane. And sugarcane was then, of course, planted by or overseen by the Colonial Sugar Refining Company, or CSR, that came from Australia. So many of the overseers, the people who went around on the horseback with the whips, etc., a lot of them actually came from Australia. And the CSR then became the major employer. Some of the farms were owned by individuals, some of the farms were owned by actually, when I say individual, European planters, and some of them actually were owned by CSR themselves. And these indentured laborers essentially worked for them. There were sugar mills in Navua, there were sugar mills in Nosori, of course, and you currently have sugar mills in Lautoka and Ba and Lambasa, and Penang used to be there too. Now, it was through that system that we had the indentured laborers that were brought to Fiji. The conditions that they went through actually were terrible, and as has been described, the Girmit experience was one firstly of deceit, it was of disease, it was of death, and it was of violence. Deceit, why? Because many of them got onto the ships not knowing where they were going. They were lured by people who were paid money to lure these people to come onto the ships. Some were told there's a great place, a land of milk and honey, it's only a few weeks away, and you'll get there and become very wealthy. They pried on people who perhaps had run away from home or had some kind of, upheaval in their lives. They obviously were a lot more vulnerable. People as young as 16 years old were picked up off the streets and lured onto the ships. And 6 to 9 months later, they landed in a place almost halfway around the world, in a place called Fiji. They had to work for 5 years, back-breaking work. If you read the stories here in this Girmit book, Ahmad Ali was one of the academics from USP who was fortunate enough to be able to interview some of the actual Girmiteers themselves. And in this particular book, it's called the Girmit Indian Indentured Experience in Fiji, they tell the actual specific stories, what they went through. And when they, the various accounts, they have the deceit. And then of course you have the disease, because you will also read here, and you read in various other accounts, people like Gillian who's written on it. And the reason I'm talking about it from a kind of academic perspective is because we hope to have the actual history recorded in our history books. Because we as a nation need to come to terms with our history. In the same way, many people do not know that in the 1800s, one of the Itoke chiefs had gone off to New South Wales, and when he came back, he had contracted measles. And as a result of that, they think that somewhere to 30 to 40,000 Itoke people died because of measles, because they had no immunity to that. That is not really written into the history books. That is not really written a lot into our mainstream curriculum. So we as a nation need to come to terms with these hardcore facts. And when you have your curriculum written during the colonized period, before we became independent, and indeed after that, you'll find that our history is actually quite sanitized. They like to clean history to present a particular view of what happened in Fiji. And that type of historical permutation we need to be able to really look at as a nation, because as a nation, if you do not come to face the realities of what we went historically, it has a huge impact on our future and indeed our present. It's very important for us to be able to understand. So the disease, of course, was on the ships they travel along, and you read in these books, a lot of them died of dysentery, of typhoid, etc. And then, of course, death. A good number of people committed suicide. They had to wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, get out to the fields. If they did not do their job, they got whipped, they got thrashed, as some of the people over here tell you. And of course, these aren't all the people. These are some of the people who were alive at the time that he decided to write this book. There was also, of course, a huge disparity, and I was highlighting some of the key issues, between men and women. The number of females that were there and the number of males, huge disparity. So of course it's caused a lot of social problems also. People died as a result of working in the fields, they died of flu, etc. And then of course there was this whole violence around it. There were women who worked in the fields where the overseers would want to use them for sexual activity at night time. This is something that has actually been written by 1 or 2 people. I think Shaista Shamim has written an article on this. That part of history obviously is not much talked about, because it was seen as something quite shameful. It was seen as something that was something you did not want to bring into the public space. But it actually did happen. And we need to be able to understand that. We need to be able to appreciate that. That was part of the Girmit experience. So Girmit, of course, and I'm giving a very abbreviated version of what happened in Girmit. Of course, they were also used to make the roads. There were no roads on Fiji. Most of you would also know, if you look at those of you studying geography, would know that if you look at all the towns in Fiji, apart from Suva, and perhaps you can argue Lautoka, every other single town is built next to a river. Why is that? Because there were no roads connecting Suva with Navua, Navua with Simitoka, with Nadi, Lautoka, Mba, Tavua, Rakaraki. The ships would come from overseas to Suva. Then from here, they would put all the goods wherever it was destined for, and would take them on these small boats called cutters. And the cutters would then go up to Simitoka River to where the town was, and they would drop things off. Then they would go to Nandi, Mba, all these places. Lambasa's got a river. So that was the mode of transportation. Of course, people then had to build roads. These people were involved in actually the building of the roads. Some later, some of course were done much later, or after Girmit was actually, after Girmit ended, in various other places. Some worked, of course, in the copra plantations, a few of them in Tavyuni. The Girmit, of course, as I said, that part of history needs to be, I think, really eked out. And it's critically important for us to be able to understand that, because it has subsequent effects. It has an impact on our political history. It has an impact on our constitutional history. It has an impact on how socio-economically we have developed. There's a quote that I want to read to you, and Gillian, who's written a lot on Fiji, and he says, and this is his observation during the Girmit and just soon after Girmit, and he says, the Girmitiers in Fiji were hardly yet a community, only a collection of poor, illiterate individuals divorced from and distrustful of the government and subservient to the Europeans. And without taking too much of your time, there's the issue about franchise. So as we know that the British government in the early 1900s set up the Legislative Council, where the governor would appoint a handful of people. He would choose people to sit in the Legislative Council, and then the other group of people were elected. And only Europeans and part Europeans could stand in the elections, and only they could vote. And it was only males that time too. Women did not have the right to vote, irrespective of their ethnicity. And then subsequently, they decided that what they used to call the Native Council, which obviously later on, in many years later, became known as the Council of Chiefs, or the Great Council of Chiefs. At that time, the Native Council then was asked to submit 6 names, and then the governor would choose 2 or 3 names from them to then sit in the Legislative Council. The Girmitiers had no representation whatsoever in the Legislative Council. After Girmit ended, or before, in fact 1969, early to 1920s, there was an agitation in the Suvarnasori corridor by the Girmitiers to have a right to vote. And there's a very famous quote by S.B. Patel, who said that we want the right to vote, even if it's a European we elect, we want to have the right to vote for him. So they did not allow that. And they said we want one person, one vote. And I can tell you the historical stuff is very, very interesting. There are people like Dr. William Sutherland, who I had the pleasure of only about 2 weeks ago meeting up in Canberra, who wrote a very poignant historical, sort of analysis, a deep socio-economic analysis of Fijian history, I should say. William Sutherland, of course, was chased out of Fiji after the 1987 coup. But he took a socio-economic perspective. And people like Simeone Durutalo, wonderful academic, who's written a number of works. Unfortunately, he died very early in his life. And I would urge, in particular the students who are here, please read these people. Read people like William Sutherland, read people like Simeone Durutalo. You can read, there are numerous other articles that have been written that will give you a good grounding in respect of what actually happened. What were the dynamics at play that led to this situation? So the British government did not allow them to have a vote. They said, we'll appoint somebody for you. A gentleman by the name of Badri Maharaj was appointed to be their representative in the Legislative Council. They rejected him. They said, we don't want him because he's been nominated, he's been selected by you, we want to vote for somebody. Then in 1928-29, male Girmitiers were given the right to vote. They no longer, of course, were Girmitiers, because Girmit had ended, were given the right to vote. And unfortunately for them, which they objected to, they said you can only vote on the basis of ethnicity. Only in those days, as they said, only an Indian can stand and only an Indian can vote for you. So people like Pandit Vishnu Deo were the ones who were elected, and they objected to it. In fact, they walked out of the Legislative Council objecting to the fact that they had to choose the candidates on the basis of ethnicity. This stalemate continued until World War II. And of course, World War II subsequently changed the dynamics. What is really interesting from a historical perspective, a socio-economic perspective, is that the antagonists, as far as the Girmitiers were concerned, were the Europeans who subjugated them. So there was always this tussle to be treated fairly, because these people were whipped, they were told to wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning, go and work in the fields, they were punished. If they felt you did not work properly, they would not pay you at all. So the entire dynamics was against the colonial government, the European government. In World War II, when they started recruiting people to go and fight the Germans, the British colony asked all of the people in its colonies to fight. The descendants of the Girmitiers then said, yes, we want to go and join the army, but we want to be paid the same wages as the European, because they also discriminated on that basis. So the Ethiopian soldiers were paid far less than the Europeans. So these Girmitiers and the descendants said, we want to fight in the war, but you have to pay us the same salary, or the 1 shilling or whatever it was, that you paid to the Europeans. They said no. So therefore they did not then participate. There was about 100 people eventually in Ba who walked into the barracks, but they were turned away because they said it's too late, we've got enough people. That gives you a perspective into what we have today in these various institutions. So of course, in 1963, when women were given the right to vote in Fiji, legally I think it was 1963-64, and they voted in the first election in 1966. When women were given the right to vote, that's when the Itaukei people were given the right to vote. And that's when the Indo-Fijian females also, of course, started voting too. This is the set of dynamics that has taken place. Ironically, of course, in Fiji, the first coup that took place was on the 14th of May, in the same parliament where we sit currently, and that was the date of the arrival of the first indentured laborers into Fiji, 14th of May, 1879. Was it a coincidence, or was it indeed planned? Leaves to be answered. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just gave a very brief history on that. But I just wanted to mention to you, and we've had discussion, of course, the Honourable Minister for Education, that the true story of Girmit needs to be told. There's, of course, a very glossy picture of the Girmit experience, and unfortunately, some of the language around it has been very much glossed over. They said the immigrants from India, etc. But they weren't actually immigrants. They're basically indentured laborers who were brought to Fiji through deceit. 99% of them. And the conditions they worked under was terrible. So we need to be able to understand this, to have an appreciation. If you go to places like Vanuatu in Lambasa, the original songs that they used to sing actually does exist in Vanuatu, more so than in Viti Levu. You'll find pockets of people. The 2 gentlemen who are performing are called The Last End of It. Some of the stories are, of course, being told through that. But the music, they developed their own music, the dynamics that actually existed in the coolie lines, what they call the coolie lines, that's where they used to live. All of this actually has, a fantastic historical basis to it, and we should be able to, understand that. We should be able to read into it. Most important thing about going back into history about something that has not been really written well about is not to apply your current social and political and economic views onto the past, because the dynamics in the past was very different to what it is. We cannot build in a narrative that actually did not exist. But what we do need to do is try and find out what actually did happen and be able to document that and be able to then appreciate that. And indeed, of course, what has happened now is that since 1879, you have now the descendants of the Girmitiers in Fiji. For them, there's no other home. Fiji is home. They are also Fijians. Many, in fact, who may have migrated also, if you go and talk to them in Auckland, Sydney, Vancouver, San Francisco, they'll say, Fiji is my home. So again, we need to be able to appreciate that whilst we actually celebrate or commemorate what happened during Girmit and the indentured system, we also need to know that there very much is part and parcel of the Fiji that came into being post-1879. So ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for turning up to this event. I understand that there will be a number of events in the lead up to 14th of May. We look forward to your participation. I would like to urge the students in particular to please go and read more. There's a lot of material available. It will give you a good appreciation and understanding of what actually the Girmitiers did go through, and to be able to learn from that, and to be able to see how we ourselves in present day Fiji can in fact improve the quality of our lives, and indeed improve the quality of our contribution to what is now our homeland. Thank you.